following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, and in the lovely part of Northern California. I'm blessed, and guess what? My guest, who is a regular on my Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, is also blessed where he lives. Peter Golenbock, St. Petersburg, Florida. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine, Ralphie. Just fine. Thanks.
Good. We were chatting off the air a little bit. We're supposed to have Pat Zachary join us. And he's a little late, but we thought we'd get it started and catch up. You have the greatest book review on your new book. I couldn't believe it. It was just absolutely. Tell us about it. Put it in your words. Tell us the project.
Well, it's funny, you write a book, and the funny thing about writing a book, and we're talking about American Nero. I did it with Richard Painter, who is a law professor at the University of Minnesota. He's been on MSNBC and CNN, and he was a Republican, and he no longer is. He ran for the Senate seat as a Democrat in this last election. But he and I have been concerned with how Donald Trump, our president, has been slowly destroying our democracy and our rule of law. So we decided we were going to write a book which would be sort of the history of all the times in our history, in our long, wonderful American history, that the rule of law has been attacked. And at the end of it, of course, discuss Trump and his role in all of this. We started, it's so funny because Trump was always talking about witch hunts, which both of us thought was very funny because one of the very, very first of those moments when the rule of law was broken was even before the Constitution. And it was, of course, in Salem, Massachusetts, when a group of people got together and started accusing women and some men of being witches. And as you and I both know, there's no such thing as witches. It's nonsense. But if enough people believe it, if you can talk somebody into believing it, you can, hang, which I think they did, hang about 14 of them before, the whole nonsense business was revealed and overwhelmed so that the country could go back to being normal again.
Normal as, my question is, if you could talk people into being witches, can you talk them into drinking Clorox?
Well, you can. You certainly can. And talk them into believing that the coronavirus started in some lab in China rather than where it really started, which was the way scientists warned us would happen, which was stop killing bats, because you risk when you're killing bats that this virus is going to get out into the world, and that's exactly what happened. It certainly started in China, but the scientists knew it was going to start in China. But getting back to some of these other phony moments, a lot of it had to do with calling people communists. If you're a communist, you're taking over our country, and you should be put in jail. And this happened a couple times. This happened around 1918-19 with the Red Scare, when they were accusing people of being communists, and all sorts of people, mostly Jews and gays, lost their jobs as teachers. And then back in the late 40s, early 50s, when Joe McCarthy pulled the same nonsense.
And ironically, his lawyer, Cohen, there's a direct connect to what's going on, Roy Cohen.
Well, Roy
who
Cohn
was
also was
a self-hating gay.
Yeah.
Yes, a self-hating gay man who would come down on the gay community.
Yep.
How sick is that? How sick is that?
Well, the thing is that it gained these people a great deal of power, and that's why you did it. McCarthy and the Republicans gained a great deal of power during the early 50s, eventually leading to General Eisenhower being elected president of the United States. And then, you know, I've got a whole book of the various and sundry things the Republicans did in the last, since 1980 with Ronald Reagan and some of the people who were operating for the Republicans back then, and some of the, you know, tricky things that they did. And never mind Nixon. But, you know, you ask me, the book comes out and what happens? There was a review in the Washington Post about a week after the thing came out, which was just magnificent. A really, really wonderful review. And we were thrilled.
Well,
and both of us were thrilled. And the disappointment, of course, was that Richard and I intended to go on MSNBC and on CNN and on, you know, various and sundry talk shows. Hopefully, you know, Bill Maher or, you know, some of the others, Jimmy Fallon, and then some late night
Peter,
shows.
I know modern technology, not both of our things. Mm-hmm. Is there a way you can get hooked up with Zoom and participate in some of these interviews with that?
Well, I mean, supposedly we have a publisher and we also have a publicist, and they tell me that they have been trying like crazy to set up these things, but that all the talk shows want to talk about right now is the coronavirus, and that's our frustration.
Well, you know what? If they don't see a definite connect between your book and what's going on now, they should be.
They should, but I'm not the guy. I am not the guy to set this up. That's why you hire a publicist. That's his job. Why you have a publisher. That's their job. And look, I've written 65 books, and with some publishers, I've had tremendous success with the publicity, and with some books.
65 books, Peter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Been doing this since 1972. Yeah.
Well, I haven't read 65 books since 1972, so don't sell yourself short on that end. But I had no idea that. I mean, I just hear about basically we talk about the 10 that were bestsellers, top of the New York Times. I didn't think that you had to go through that. You would be having to write 65 books to get to 10 bestsellers. In other words, and you're incredibly prolific at that, 65 books.
Yeah, and you know,
was the Yankee book the first book? Of course, you broke out, but was there any other manuscripts before that out of Peter Golenbock?
There were a couple of things that I was going to do. There were a couple cops in Brooklyn, Bobby Greenberg and a fellow named Hans, the two of them, and they ultimately made a movie called The Super Cops. And before I wrote Dynasty, I was living in New York, and I wrote a magazine article for the New York Times on the two cops. And for some reason, the police department squashed it. They didn't want these two guys getting any more famous than they were. And so that was my first attempt before Dynasty. And that thing,
now this was back in the Serpico days. This
was back 1970, 1971 when this was.
Okay. what about being a policeman in those days shocked you and surprised you and intrigued you?
Well,
What?
what surprised me was that Greenberg and Hans took me one weekend with them on their rounds. And, I didn't really think of it at the time, but a lot of it had to do with drugs. And we went into Bedford-Stuyvesant and we knocked on doors and we, went into homes and talked to people who were their sources.
Mm-hmm.
It occurred to me just how dangerous. Serpico was a movie that came out around that time. And, what they were doing wasn't terribly, terribly different from what Serpico was doing. Except, of course, Serpico was ratting on the rest of the police officers.
Right.
And he ended up getting shot.
In
Anthony
the face
Greenberg,
by a cop.
By a cop, yeah. But it was like we would go to one of these homes in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and they would say to me, stand around the corner and make sure you don't get shot. Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Willingly.
Yeah. Well, I graduated from law school in 1970, and so I was sort of, kind of tangentially connected with, law and order in that respect.
Okay. Was it as much fun or as exciting as, say, doing Dynasty? Moment-to-moment excitement in researching it and writing with these guys was because you could have turned in to be a crime reporter.
Well, later on, when I was working at the Bergen Record after I wrote Dynasty, there was a fellow by the name of Joseph Callinger, and he was a shoemaker, and he had murdered a woman. And I thought to myself, now this would make a really fantastic book. And so I got in touch with the district attorney who was prosecuting the case, and we agreed that we were going to write a book about the Callinger case. And I was, at the time, working on the copy desk. And so I was working from 10 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And then I would go, when the courtroom opened at 9, and I would go and sit and take notes while that case was being prosecuted. And
Whoa.
Only to find out that one of the major publishers gave, and I can't remember her name, the name of the writer, but at the time gave her $100,000 to write a book on that case. And the book was called The Shoemaker, and it was a #1 bestseller. And as a result, once she got that contract, that no other publisher was going to, opt for a second contract on the same subject. So that sort of went by the boards too. But I've done others. Fairly recently, I did a book called Presumed Guilty, which I did with the lawyer for Casey Anthony. Casey Anthony, as most of you know, was a 22-year-old who had a 3-year-old daughter, and one day the daughter basically disappeared, and she was accused of killing her. And all the, Fox TV and Nancy Grace just every day hammered her for being guilty of killing her daughter. Jose Baez was the defense attorney, and he and I, collaborated and wrote this book, which did become a New York Times bestseller. And still,
Peter, was she not guilty, or was she presumed? Was she not guilty, or was she innocent, or both?
Both. It was such a very interesting case because her father had been having sex with her since she was 8 years old. And in fact, when the girl was born, the father took a drive to a motel and took drugs to try to kill himself because he was sure that baby was his baby. And he was a police officer. And because he was a police officer, when the kid disappeared and ultimately was found in a black bag in the woods, nobody looked at him because he had been a police officer. And in fact, what actually happened what actually happened, despite all the phony evidence that the district attorney, who, I always thought he should have been thrown in jail for making up crap, but I found out that this sort of thing happens all the time. What happened was that the child was in the care of the father, and the father either wasn't paying attention to the child or was somehow occupied, and the kid opens up the sliding doors, goes out to the pool, goes up the steps of the pool, goes into the pool, and drowns. And so the father and Casey Anthony look for the kid and find the kid in the pool dead. So the father says to Casey Anthony, "Don't worry about it, I'll take care of it." And all along, every time one of their pets died, the father would take a black plastic bag, put the pet in the bag, and throw the bag into the woods. Well, that's what he did with the kid. He took the kid, put the kid in a plastic bag, threw the kid into the woods, hoping nobody would find her. Okay? And then, after, the child's missing, where is she? He started then, pointing the evidence towards his daughter. Because obviously he didn't want to be, the one who they accused. I mean, a truly despicable human being this guy was. And her problem, too, was because she had been having sex with her father, she was trying to protect him from that information. And so she made up a whole bunch of stories as to where the kid was. She said that the nanny took the kid. The nanny was entirely made up. There was no nanny. And so because she was lying to the cops figured she did it because she was lying. It was a complicated mess. It was a very, very interesting book to write.
Was there any one thing that broke the case for the defense attorney?
Nothing broke the case for the defense attorney except that the Casey told the defense attorney exactly what happened. And so if Jose, believes what she's telling him, then he knows that the various and sundry things that the prosecution is making up can't be true. That's the fact that Casey had put the baby in the trunk and there were flies in the trunk because the baby had been in the trunk. Well,
wasn't there a pizza or something in the trunk?
The pizza had been in the trunk for 2 weeks, and that's a large reason why there were flies. But
right.
But when you know what really happens, you take all those various and sundry, nonsense that the prosecution is making up. And I must tell you, Jose went the longest mile. I mean, he went to Europe to study a certain aspect of, some kind of science, to learn that what the prosecution was saying was made up. I mean, he went way out of his way to defend this woman. It was
forensic
very,
medicine and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It was fascinating for me to see the ends that this guy went, and he became, incredibly famous as a result of it. He got a gig at Harvard University. He ended up defending Aaron Hernandez of the New England Patriots, who had been accused of murder.
I remember that.
And
yes.
And at a trial, the verdict came back that he was not guilty of the murders that he was accused of. And then, of course, Aaron hanged himself in his cell, and that was the end of that.
Right. Do you have another project after your book just came out? What do you go on to? Or is there ever a time where you just want to sit back and say, I'm going to rest on my laurels a little bit?
No, there are no laurels. No laurels. Screw the laurels. No laurels. The next project. Every project is the excitement of it. I have finished a book, which I am very excited about, called Whispers of the Gods. Over the years, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of ball players, and I took about 20 of my very best interviews, and I put them together in the hopes that this would be the sequel to The Glory of Their Times by Larry Ritter. By Larry Ritter. That's exactly right. And so I've got 2 chapters. It starts and ends with chapters with Jim Bouton, which are really fabulous chapters. And I've got some, truly wonderful people in this book.
Well, help me, because you and I never hooked up with Jim Bouton. I called him once, and it was just after he had started somewhat of a downhill road in terms of his mental capabilities. He was using it. He said to me on the phone, he says, "The bulldog has no teeth."
Yep. That's very interesting.
That was his words.
Yeah.
So, but I never hooked up with him on the phone or on an interview with you. And
well, I mean,
it's something I regret.
Yeah.
So, one of my heroes for a number of reasons, not just, I'll tell you what they were. His comeback was why he became a hero to me.
Well,
43 years old.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that I was involved with that. I lived in Englewood. I lived in Englewood, and he lived in Englewood, New Jersey. And after I interviewed him for Dynasty, we became like brothers. We were closest of friends for about 5 years. He played on the CBS All-Star team. He invited me to come and play with him. I ended up playing with the CBS All-Stars for 6-7 years as a result of that. I babysit his children. He and his wife Bobby and I were very, very, very close. We every once in a while, we'd go to the gym, and he'd throw his knuckleball and I'd catch him, which was interesting because, this is a high school gym and it's sort of dark, and he's major league pitcher throwing to me.
Throwing a knuckleball.
One afternoon, Mike Kekich came over. They were friends. And Kekich threw about 90 miles an hour, and I had to catch him. It was an awful lot of fun, he and his friends. And, of course, he worked on the show. He was writing a show called Ball 4, and I was involved with that a little bit. I discovered I had no...
I remember that. I remember that television show. And Big Ben Davidson was I'm living out in Northern California. There's a bar in Danville where I happened to live at the time, right across the street from where I worked. It was called Big Ben's.
Oh wow!
And I go in there. I introduce myself to him. I'm a kid insurance man, 22, 23 years old. And there's a picture of one of my other heroes, Joe Willie Namath.
Oh, yeah.
Big mural of Joe Willie with Ben driving him into the ground.
Exactly right. Yep.
Very famous picture of that.
I know the picture, right.
And that was in the mural.
Yep.
And he was a Jewish guy, and he and I were the only 2 Jews in Northern California.
That's right.
It seems he goes, Jew boy, with this big.
He had that great mustache.
Right, and the gravelly voice.
Right.
But he had he was a mushy guy,
Yeah.
That was all outwards, but he says, I'm going to give you a tab. I didn't even know what a bar tab was. I'm 23 years old.
Well,
I'm going to give you a tab, and I know where you are. I'll come get you. You better.
You're talking about Jim's comeback. Well,
yes.
I was somehow involved in Jim's comeback. His comeback was pitching for the Atlanta Braves. They gave him an opportunity to start against the Los Angeles Dodgers. This was in 1978. And Jim calls me up and says, I'm pitching for Atlanta. Would you like to come down and watch me pitch? And I said, great. I said, okay. He says, I'll leave you a ticket to fly down. And he did. He left me a ticket. And sitting next to me was a woman by the name of Paula. And this was Jim's girlfriend. Paula. Unknowns to me, the idea was that I was to tell people, if anybody asked, that Paula was with me.
You with the beard.
I was the beard. I was the beard. And, I was so close to Jim. That's what he wanted me to do. Fine. I didn't think to myself, well, what if Bobby finds out about this? Boy, is she going to think that I'm terrible? But I didn't do that. I said, okay, if that's what you want me to do, that's fine. I can do that. So we go to the game, and he pitches, and then I go home, and then he divorces Bobby and marries Paula. And
so they had adopted kids and all.
Well, one of them was adopted. Two of them were theirs. David was adopted. But but what happened was Paula was one of those people who decided that Jim was going to leave all of his friends behind. And they moved to Western Massachusetts, and basically he left all of his friends. And I knew most of his friends. He left them all behind. And he became a totally different person. We used to have so much fun. We would race our cars on the streets of Englewood. When we played for the CBS All-Star team, we would go to the amusement parks, and we'd ride the go-karts, and we'd play games, and it was just a total hoot. And after he and Paula got together, she was a psychiatrist or psychologist, and he became a businessman. And all the joy of his life went out. It was like he was a totally different person. It was really weird. And then, of course, I moved to Florida in '89 for the Senior Professional Baseball League, for the Senior League.
Right.
And I never saw them again. I never did see them again. I talked to him on the phone a couple of times, but it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same person. So, she had stolen his brain, and a different person had gotten into that head of his. He was a different person. And Paula treated the three kids horribly. She had kids of her own, and those were the kids that she treated well. And basically, she shunned the other three kids. And even when Jim had his funeral, she would not allow the son to speak at the funeral. I mean, it was terrible. But going back to why we're talking about him in the first place, I have interviewed so many wonderful people over the years, and this book has got not only Boughton, but one day when I was living in Englewood, I got a call from a guy named Ed Froelich. Who's Ed Froelich? He was the trainer for Joe McCarthy. He was the trainer for Joe McCarthy when McCarthy was managing the Cubs and the Yankees and the Red Sox. And also, Froelich had been in Brooklyn when Babe Ruth was a coach with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And Froelich tells the most magnificent stories where Babe Ruth tells him this, that, and the other. It's like listening to Babe Ruth talk. It's just fantastic. So that's the next chapter.
Did you have tapes? You had tapes.
Oh, I still have tapes. I have tapes of all this stuff. Oh, yeah.
So you've transcribed the tapes?
Yeah, that's what I do. That's my life, transcribing tapes. Yes. Yes, I did. Yep.
Wow.
Yep. And then the next one is Rex Barney, who pitched for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he's got some wonderful stories to tell about all sorts of people, and Jackie Robinson, of course. And then Stan Musial, who was a wonderful interview with the Cardinals. And then the next one is Tom Sturdivant, who's got these magnificent stories about Mickey Mantle that are just truly wonderful. And then Jim
in your book Dynasty,
yeah,
he comes out as a happy Southern guy. He
was an
a good old boy.
He wasn't Southern. He was Oklahoman. He was a good old boy, though. He was, and he loved to laugh and have a good time and told me wonderful stories. But the thing is, of course, when you interview these people, you can only use, 2 pages of it. And then the interviews are 30 pages. So you take the best of the 30 pages and put them out there, and it's just wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Well, therein lies a skill, Peter, on your part.
Well, the fortunate thing is that I've got these tapes. Thank heaven I've got these tapes. But
you have to learn. You have to determine what goes in and what goes out.
Well, sure.
Was there?
Well, of course.
What was a tough cut in the book you just completed?
Well, I can't even tell you that. I don't know. That is too complicated a question. Nothing good. I took out the boring stuff. You take out the boring stuff and leave in the interesting stuff. I mean, that's basically how it works. I mean, writing a book, quite frankly, is a very simple thing to do. All you have to do is have your reader go from page 1 to page 2. And after he's finished with page 2, to go to page 3. And by the time he gets to page 500, he's done.
That's it.
That's as simple as it could be. That's all.
Yeah, and you hope he puts your book on his bookshelf.
That's
and
right.
Goes back to it every now and again and browses. Just
well, I mean,
wow.
I was incredibly fortunate. We've talked about this before. You know, for me to show up at the Yankees and say I want to write a book, and I went to Marty Appel and have Marty say, "Oh, of course, if you can get a book contract, you can write a book." And then he says to me, "But there's no way in heck that you will ever get a book contract. Who the hell are you?" And he was absolutely right.
Didn't you have a bit of a head start on that?
Head start how?
Well, didn't you work with someone or?
Well, I worked as an attorney at Prentice Hall, and
okay.
I went down to the trade book head, and I basically talked him into giving me a contract to write Dynasty. Yeah. So once I got that contract,
you knew the right person, and the trick is to know.
I didn't know the right person. You ask the question. What's the name of the guy running the trade book department? And they tell you, and you go and knock on his door and say hi. I got an idea for a book. What do you think? And it turned out he was a huge Yankee fan like I was, and he gave me a contract. I'm still convinced that if he had been a Red Sox fan, my life would have been entirely different.
Okay, huge Yankee fan, I want you to do me a favor when this interview is over.
Yeah.
Go to YouTube.
Yeah.
Go to YouTube.
Yeah.
And they have baseball games that have been on the radio. Just push in Yankees radio, and you'll come up with a list of games and listen to Phil Rizzuto announce.
Well, Rizzuto is chapter 10. Phil Rizzuto is chapter 10 in this book.
When he was in his prime as an announcer,
he was spectacular.
There was no one better. There was no one better. I listened to that guy on my walk this morning.
That's right.
Ralph Terry pitched against the Red Sox, and he does the entire game.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody was doing TV that day or whatever, but he does an entire game with, remember at the end, I'm going, time to go out, what's on your scorecard, wasn't watching, this, that, and the other thing. I got to leave early, get over the bridge, White, take it, right? It was charming. It was charming.
I was driving down up the New Jersey Turnpike one day, and I'm sitting there listening to Phil Rizzuto on the Yankee game, and Phil talks about having a conversation with the Statue of Liberty. I almost drove off the road. I mean, he was wonderful. I mean,
his Hall of Fame induction, that's all over YouTube as well.
Well, what's interesting about Phil, which is included in this chapter in this book, and if there are any publishers out there listening, I'm telling you, this is the book you want. Because I've been told by at least 3 or 4 publishers that nobody is buying baseball books anymore. And I'm telling you, I don't believe that for a second. I just don't. But this is a case where Phil Rizzuto in 1956, this is the end of his career, and George Weiss and Casey Stengel call him in for a meeting. And they say, Phil, we just bought Eno Slaughter from the Cardinals. We need a left-hand hitting outfielder to fill out our team, and we've got to get rid of one of our players. Who would you suggest? So Phil starts picking, a couple of the lesser pitchers, and they go, oh, no, we need this guy. So they pitched, the third string catcher, Charlie Silvera, and they go, oh, no, we need that guy. Eventually, Phil figures out that the guy they're getting rid of is him. And it was. They were getting rid of him. And this was at the All-Star game. This was at the All-Star game. Can you imagine this guy? He was the MVP of the American League in 1950 and led the Yankees to so many pennants. And in 1956, at the All-Star game, basically they're kicking him off the team. But Phil,
well, it wasn't the All-Star game. It was the Old Timers game.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I meant Old Timers Day. It was the Old Timers Day.
Makes it worse, infinitely worse.
Much worse. It makes it much worse because Phil said to me, I had no idea I was about to become an old timer that afternoon, which is absolutely true. I know it.
That's
hilarious.
a great line.
I know. So what Phil says to me, he says, I was furious. I just was furious. But who was the wonderful second baseman who he had played with in the late 1940s? Was
Jerry Coleman?
No, before him, George
Sternweiss.
George Sternweiss happened to be with him that day, and George Sternweiss gave him wonderful advice. He said, "Phil, keep quiet, don't make a stink, just go home," and he did. And about a week later, what happened was other teams wanted him to be the announcer. There were a couple teams, he told me. The Baltimore Orioles wanted him to be their play-by-play announcer.
Whoa!
But he didn't want to leave New York. He wanted to stay in New York, so he turned them down. And another team, I think it was Oakland or somebody like that, one of the other teams also wanted him to be their permanent play-by-play announcer. And he turned them down. And about 2 weeks after that, the Yankees came around and said, "We'd like you to be the third guy." And so it was Mel Allen and Red Barber. And he, yeah. And
what a way to break in! And by the time they broke him in, I preferred listening to him over those two guys. At that stage of
he was such a free spirit, but don't denigrate Mel Allen in any way.
Oh no! But this was late in his
right.
Absolutely, but this was late in both.
Phil, not so late. Phil went to 1965, 66, somewhere in there. Not Phil. Mel went to 55, 56. Mel was still around for another 10 years. And Barber.
Well, Red Barber was a bit embittered.
He was embittered. Red Barber was embittered. When I wrote Bums, I wrote a chapter about Red Barber where I just praised him to the sky. And we did a TV show together, and he just was nasty. He wasn't, he was so nasty that the TV show took his part out, left it out, because he was so critical of what how do you know how much money I was making? Why didn't you call me and ask me how much money I was making? Well, it was because it was in the newspapers. I didn't have to call you. It was right there in the newspapers, for crying out loud. But, you can't argue on the air with Red Barber. Fortunately, they were taping it. And so when the show was over, they cut his part out. But getting back to Phil Rizzuto, because he didn't, scream and holler and carry on like so many other, players might have. I mean, he was a sweet, sweet man. He was just a wonderful guy.
But I could imagine how much he must have been hurt that day.
I can't
imagine, really.
No. It must have been just awful. He cried.
And he and Casey didn't get along from the start because, if I remember correctly,
you do.
Didn't Casey, when he tried out with Brooklyn, when Casey was the manager, and Phil was a Brooklyn kid, and he was diminutive.
He was 5'1".
Not later on, I think he grew, but when he tried,
he grew to be
5'4".
Yeah, he was taller than that. He was 5'8".
Yeah.
But But Casey told him to go get a shoe shine box. That you'll never be a major league ball player, and Phil never forgave him. Never.
Right.
Never, ever, 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 ever. Just you're told something like that. I mean, that's what's amazing about these people. They're told by Casey Stengel, who even in 1930s he had been a ball player since 1920. I mean, everybody knew who Casey Stengel was. He had managed Boston, he had managed Brooklyn, and here's Casey Stengel telling Phil Rizzuto, go get yourself a shoe shine box. You'll never be a ball player. And despite that,
it's an insight to Casey's real, and I've heard this from on other interviews. Bobby Richardson hated the son of a bitch.
No, Bobby Richardson did, but see, it's very complicated too, because Bobby Richardson. This is way off the subject, but when Yogi Berra was the manager, the two guys who complained about Yogi Berra were Bobby Richardson and Tony Kubek. So it sounds to me like Bobby was a complainer.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So anyhow,
great Phil Lynn story on the bus. That's a classic.
That is a classic. But I mean,
with Mickey goes, play on. He said. Yogi said, "Play more,
louder." No, he said, "Play louder." He said, "Play it louder." Play it louder. Yeah. No, Mickey was hilarious. Mickey was wonderful. Chapter 14 is with Roger Maris. It was the last interview anybody had with Roger Maris before he died. Last major interview. So he's in there.
Was this the time that you waited with Cleet Boyer in a ball?
Sure was. Yeah, it was. Yep.
I got a pretty good memory. After you and I have been doing this.
I know.
3 years, 4 years now.
Yeah. Roy Campanella's in this. Ellis Clary. I loved Ellis Clary because Ellis Clary he talked about the Pete Gray. What I loved about the St. Louis Browns more than anything else is how the players basically hated Pete Gray, which I found so interesting. He was the one-armed outfielder. The one year he played, the Browns had won the pennant in 1944, and they were on their way to winning it again in 1945 until the owner of the team decided they wanted Pete Gray, this one-armed outfielder, playing center field for the Browns to draw more fans. And he was not as talented as the veterans that they had. And as a result
with two arms.
Yeah, right. But as a result of the discord, a couple of the pitchers would try to basically terrorize Pete Gray. They put dead fish in the pockets of his sport jacket. They would taunt him. I mean, they made his life really miserable. It's a very interesting story, and Ellis Clary tells it, and so that's why I put it in there. Gene Conley is in there, and I have Conley in there because, as you know, Conley, after losing a game to the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, disappeared from Pumpy Green, and they were headed to Jerusalem. And this is the story that Gene tells us what that was all about. And it's very, very interesting. Anyhow, the book comes with pictures, and I'm going to get this thing published, if I have to stand on somebody's street corner and hand the thing out. But it's really quite a remarkable book. Beautiful. Yeah.
Hey, what a terrific show tonight. We missed Pat Zachary. But
we'll catch up with him. Let me tell you something. Pat Zachary's got a very, 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 very interesting story. Pat Zachary is the guy, when the Mets traded Tom Seaver to Cincinnati, Pat Zachary was the guy whose role it was to replace Seaver. Can you just imagine the reception that he got from the Mets fans when he started pitching? And yet, if I remember correctly, he had something like a 14-7 record. Pat Zachary was a very, very, very fine pitcher. He was also a pitcher for the St. Pete Pelicans, and that's where we became friends when the Pelicans won the championship of the Senior League in 1989-90. So.
And he was also he was a key figure in the book you wrote on the Mets.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So and as you know, I'm an incredible New York Mets fan, and I want to hear about Dougie Flynn and Steve Henderson and Dan Norman and the guys who came with him, and what incredible pressure on all of those guys.
Yeah, was Lenny Randall. I'm trying to think. It was Lenny Randall, Steve Henderson.
It wasn't Lenny Randall. It was Dan Norman.
No, Dan Norman on the Pelicans. We didn't have Dan Norman.
Oh no.
You're talking about the trade. Oh, of course.
The trade.
Right. The trade. Yes. Dan Norman, Steve Henderson got traded to the Mets from the Cardinals. Yes, you're absolutely right.
With one of the most one of the slickest middle infielders the Mets ever had, and that was Doug Flynn.
That's right. Dougie Flynn. Yep. Meanwhile, I am in the middle of writing a proposal with one of your favorite players, Ed Kranepool. That's what I'm doing right now. So
yes, I had Lenny Randall introduce me on the air to Eddie Kranepool a while back, and the three of us chatted about those early Mets days.
Good.
But my tribute for the evening is to Phil Rizzuto and the pain he felt, and he didn't deserve it. You know, there are some people that when they get their uppings or whatever, or things go bad, you go, well, that's karma, this, that, and the other thing. Bullshit to that.
You get sort of a notion that there was a certain amount of, I don't know, malice or you know, why would you do that to somebody? Why would you call somebody in, Weiss and Stengel, and say to them, okay, pick the person who we're going to cut, and have them pick 4 or 5 players, and then finally let him realize that he's the one? Why wouldn't you just call him in and say, okay, we're cutting you, that's it, see you, bye? Why?
Right.
It just seemed, it seemed...
and especially the day, again, the old-timers day, it seems cruel beyond cruel.
Well, I can only think that perhaps Stengel, knowing that he and Phil didn't get along, you know, Phil didn't treat him with the respect that Casey felt he deserved during the whole time Phil was a Yankee, because of what happened, you know, when he tried out for Brooklyn. So, you know, maybe this was a way that Casey was getting back at him. I mean, it's very possible. There's no real way of knowing.
I don't know, but he led him to like 5 world championships in a row.
That's for sure. No,
there has to be a little bit. Okay, Phil. You know, I didn't like you when you were 12, but I liked you for those 5 years in a row.
I know.
I know. You know, human nature makes you shake your head.
It does indeed. Anyhow, have a great week.
You too, my friend.
We'll talk to you
and
soon.
The best to both of you, Wendy's.
Thank you so much.
Be well.
All right, take care.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for listening. It was fun for me as 99. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.